Hello fellow collectors, I hope you are doing very well indeed. Today we are continuing on with my monthly series where I talk about the best films I watched in the preceding month, and today we look at my September in film. Well, after a very busy month film-wise in August, I slowed down a fair bit in September and only got through 26 in the end. But I've actually been using the time to read a lot more. As we are now in the last quarter of the year, I've been looking at my goals for 2024, and one of them included, of course, what I wanted to read this year, and my goodness am I far behind, so I've put a lot more effort into stories on the page rather than stories on the screen. But that being said, I still watched some absolutely great stuff this month. And so, without any further ado, let's talk about the best films I watched in September. First up, and we have the Star Wars films. Now, I don't think I'll ever make a video dedicated to Star Wars, so I hope you'll indulge me a little as I wax lyrical here a bit more generally about them. But if you don't care about Star Wars or my thoughts on them, which I wouldn't hold against you, then I have put timestamps in the description below and you can skip ahead to the next one, which is some wonderful Italian cinematic brilliance. So recently I've had a bit of a hankering to revisit the Star Wars films, as the last time I watched them all was when these lovely steelbook sets were released, which was back in 2020, so it's been about 4 years. And to quote from How I Met Your Mother, if you're not trilling at least once every 3 years, the dark side wins. So it was certainly time I saw them again. Now, I'm someone who grew up loving Star Wars. It is a film series that has meant an awful lot to me for an awful long time, but with the new films and Disney's direction, my passion has pretty much died a death, and my enthusiasm has been at an all-time low for several years now, and to be honest, I'd just moved on really. But quite recently I've been dipping my toe into comic books to see if they are a medium that I'll enjoy. And I actually came across a post on Reddit and discovered that there is actually a huge host of Star Wars comics. And so long before even The Phantom Menace or any of the prequels had come out, there was already stories taking place during the original trilogy, prequel stories taking place long before it, and stories taking place in the aftermath of Return of the Jedi. Discovering this fanned some of the low-burning embers of my dwindling interest, and actually excited me a little bit to see what sort of stories there might be to explore. And so, as I've been reading some of those, I've really wanted to watch the films again, and so I watched the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy. I have to say I have pretty much no interest in the sequel trilogy at all. Frankly, 4 years has not been anywhere near enough time to make me want to revisit any of those films yet. I think what is most interesting to me about these films is how my reaction to them has changed over time. For many years, The Empire Strikes Back was my favourite, but I'd say for well over a decade now, the original Star Wars has been my personal number one. And rewatching it this time, I'm simply amazed that a film I've seen more times than I can count can still encourage such an emotional reaction from me. Despite the fact that this might well be the film I've seen the most times in my life, whenever I revisit it every few years, it remains so incredibly special, as it mixes wonderful science fiction with action, adventure, great characters, and mystery. It is still a rush to watch, and the story retains its ability to enthrall. Like for so many of us, this is one of my all-time favourites that lives up to my memories each time I watch it, which is no small feat. It's a film that I think becomes more than the sum of its parts, as it manages to somehow transcend its limitations and still delight both adults and children alike, and it just captures your imagination like nothing else really. Surely unsurpassed in cultural significance, it remains, as always, a phenomenally fun ride. The original trilogy, I think, as I'm sure many of us do, is just absolutely top tier. Each one works so well. As Empire expands a little and builds characterisation from A New Hope, and Return of the Jedi again builds wonderfully on Empire, and it all culminates brilliantly. For me, as I said, the first I think is the best, followed closely by Empire, and Return of the Jedi will always be a little bit let down by the Ewoks in my eyes. I forget what I thought of them as a child, but to me these days it always feels like the first decision made solely on the basis of merchandising. But overall, just a superb trilogy that hits all the right emotional beats and immerses you in a great spacefaring adventure of good overcoming evil. Now, the prequels are always a more interestingly mixed bag. I was 9 years old when The Phantom Menace came out, and so the prequel trilogy to me really were my Star Wars growing up, as they were coming out in a cinema and I was old enough to enjoy and appreciate them to a certain extent. and so my ability to watch them with any sort of objectivity is pretty much non-existent, and honestly, I still enjoy them for what they are. However, my thoughts on them seem to change, sometimes drastically, with each rewatch, and this one was no different, as my takes were very different to my thoughts in 2020. This time, as soon as I read the taxation of trade routes in the Phantom Menace's opening word scroll, I just thought, wow, that never gets any easier to read, and it's just such a come down from the great simplicity of the original three. This watch through, I found the Phantom Menace much more mediocre than previously. Now don't get me wrong, I think there is still a lot to like, for me anyway, and the Duel of the Fates is surely one of the finest sequences in any Star Wars film. Absolutely superb stuff, and John Williams was on fire when he wrote that score. Interestingly, Attack of the Clones I found much more watchable this time than previously, as back in 2020 I remember it was a real slog to get through. It's interesting enough, and I like the general storyline of the search for the bounty hunter, but it's undoubtedly a clunky and uneven film, with a romance that is so incredibly poorly tacked on. Still, this time I was able to make it through without as much trouble as in past years. And lastly, Revenge of the Sith. After so many of my younger years were spent loving it, these days again I think it's a much more mediocre film, with a few highs but quite a lot of lows too. Particularly the culmination of really the entire 6 films I think is done astonishingly poorly. But it still has some great and tense moments between Anakin and Obi-Wan to enjoy, despite the very shaky dialogue. And I always enjoy General Grievous, who is just a great villain, and I think it's a real shame that we didn't see him in Attack of the Clones as well. And so, overall, a very mixed bag indeed. Despite the myriad shortcomings of the prequels, I still enjoy them to a certain extent, and I really like seeing how my opinions change over time with each watch through. But, of course, to no one's surprise, the original trilogy is by far, of course, the standout. It is such a wonderful journey that I continue to love every time I revisit the films. And not forgetting that this is my video on the best films I watched in September, certainly these original 3 are on my list. And then we move on to something completely different, which is La Signora Senza Camelia, or The Lady Without Camellias. It's a film from 1953 and directed by the great Michelangelo Antonioni, and stars Lucia Bosé, Andrea Cecchi, Gino Cervi, Ivan Desny, Alan Cooney, Monica Clay and many more. Again, I'll use one of my favourite and overdone phrases because I wish I had gotten to this one sooner. It has been sat on my shelf for well over 2 years at this point, and I absolutely loved it. In a way, this is a classic tale as old as Hollywood, about a beautiful girl from an unassuming family who gets discovered and becomes a movie star. And everything then happens to her, without her really having any agency in her life, until she realises and then takes control. To begin with, I thought this was going to be about beauty and controlling it, as we see particularly from one of the producers that she meets. In some ways he tries to capture, contain and hoard her beauty for himself, and I thought the film might go along the lines of gifts and beauty were given to share with the world and it's almost a crime to keep them to yourself or hide them away. But actually the film takes a turn and goes down a different path than I was expecting. I feel like this film was meta before that term was even coined, as it's really amusing on a film industry in general as well, on crazy producers who get in over their heads, on actors' success, failure and financing, and it's almost like a film within a film in some ways, as the story it tells, centering on our main character Clara, takes on a highly melodramatic life, mirroring the almost exaggerated stories that we see on screen. As she starts to take agency in her life eventually, to take control of her destiny so to speak, to see what she can truly be as an actor, she visits someone for advice and gets told this fantastic line: "Clara, you're beautiful. Until now they've done nothing but photograph your beauty. Maybe you can't do more than that. Or maybe you can discover as an actress the meaning of your life. But you haven't tried yet, neither for yourself or for others." I absolutely loved that. Such incredibly powerful words that I'm sure ring as true today for many actors as it did back then. Overall, this was a really interestingly melancholic film, I think. It's a film about when beauty is all someone has, how everyone seems to want a piece of it, And while they might search for meaning, how hard that can be when everyone has already reduced you to a statue which is nice to look at and nothing more. A pretty brutal film in some ways actually, and an emotionally tough one, but really brilliant and incredibly engaging. To my shame, I have only seen 3 of Antonioni's films so far, but my goodness, this has spurred me on to make sure I watch as many as I can. Next up, we have Model Shop, a film from 1969 and directed by the great Jacques Demy, and this one was his only English language film. It stars Gary Lockwood, who you might recognise from 2001 A Space Odyssey, as well as Anouk Aimée and Alexandra Hay. This one is a sort of very loose sequel to Demy's earlier film called Lola from 1961, as we see Anouk Aimée reprise her role as that character, and we also see references to some of his other films here, including Bay of Angels. And if there's any series of films that deserves to be a cinematic universe, it is undoubtedly the films of Jacques Demy, so I'm glad that they all link up in some way. This one is a slow and meandering tale to a certain extent, but it's beautifully stylised and shot, with some great tracking camera work. Lots of this is filmed on the streets in the usual French guerrilla style of filmmaking, and I think it makes a really interesting comparison filming on the streets here in the States to what we see with filming on the streets in France and how the regular people react to the camera. I found this one utterly captivating. It is such an intriguing and interesting story, as we have a man in his mid-20s with dreams and desires, but kind of unsure how to realise them, or probably more accurately, even the specifics about them. He randomly sees a beautiful and mysterious woman, and is then almost magnetically drawn to her, and we follow him over the course of this day in his life. Our main character is a man that is surrounded by things that just seem to have happened, similarly in a way to La Signora Senza Camelia, where you feel like he's fallen into things without all that much agency. They say life happens when we aren't looking, and you feel like that's very much the case for him here. He has a girlfriend who lives with him, but there's no real spark there, and it feels more like a convenience rather than anything else. He's a character, again, here to a certain extent, that you feel wants to take control. He wants to make something happen, to create something with his life. But he's struggling with the world he lives in, which is late 1960s Los Angeles, and in particular with the threat of the draft for Vietnam constantly hanging over his head like the proverbial sword of Damocles. And that puts him into this state of forced apathy, where he feels an inability to start anything meaningful with his life. He drives around in a car he can't pay for, doing silly things instead of the sensible ones. You feel like he's driving to get away from his problems, but he stays in the same city, on the same roads, making the same turns, and you just sense that it's like he's running on a treadmill. Sure, he's moving, but he's not really going anywhere, and he can't escape his problems. Now, granted, it's been a while since I saw it, but when I watched Lola, I enjoyed it a lot, but I didn't love it. But in this film, her character really shines, more than I was expecting. Played brilliantly again by Anouk Aimée, she is the mystery here, the goal, something to strive for, and something to discover for him. And yet, we see that she also has her problems, her own goals. Her life has changed and moved on since we last met her, and she is also in somewhat a state of flux. This is a film where it feels like nothing happens as it should, or perhaps as you might expect it to. From their first glance of each other to their first meeting, it was all so interesting and unexpected, and their short journey together during the runtime also perhaps does not go at all how you might imagine. What I liked a lot here is that I think a lot of the emotions of the characters are subtext and just lurking beneath the surface. Lockwood and Aimée had this fantastic chemistry together and work wonderfully, both portraying and channeling restrained characters in some way. Really, they are two very melancholic characters, together just for a brief flicker of a moment, and for a reason. Is it to shore up one another's drive or self-esteem, or perhaps to just give each other a bit of courage to do what they need to do? Well, you'll have to watch it and decide for yourself. Overall, I thought it was brilliant and I loved it, and it had a great soundtrack too, done by a band called Spirit. And now we move on to my section where I talk about the great films that I haven't quite been able to make my mind up on yet. They might have been particularly curious or mysterious or just intriguing in some way. And I've got two that fall into that category for this month. First up is The Conformist, a film from 1970 and directed by Bernardo Bertolucci. It stars Jean-Louis Trintignant, as well as Stefania Sandrelli, Gaston Motion and Dominique Sanda. This was a mesmerising and almost dreamlike film in many ways, which might explain why I haven't quite been able to pin it down. It's a story that charts some of Italy's fascist years, and then briefly also its downfall. Our main character is played by Jean-Louis Trintignant, who, as usual, was just excellent, alongside actually some stunning performances from the supporting characters too, including Dominique Sanda, who was also in Novecento, which is another of Bertolucci's films about Italy set partly during its fascist years. This was just such a mysterious watch, but an incredibly engaging one, and I'd describe it almost like a subdued thriller. It was like watching an internal battle on screen where one man, he works for the powers that be, kind of seems to change his mind and then maybe changes it again, and he seems to be struggling with the ideas that he now represents. He's a man you feel of internal contradictions, or perhaps he's just a man without any actual convictions. He clearly wants power and so follows power, but he's no true believer. You get the sense that he wants to get as much as he can, as easily as he can, and then just enjoy his status. He's crafty, but not really that intelligent. He can give orders, but doesn't really want to be a man who takes action. All of this, though, is sort of bubbling under the surface, as it's all shown in a very removed way, and I describe it almost like a moat that surrounds a castle, as his internal battles and work surround the story to a certain extent, without us actually seeing all that much of it. Just an incredibly curious film that I think has a really great depth to it, that only one watch through so far hasn't really scratched the surface of yet. Of course, calling it The Conformist might give you an idea of not only what fascism wants to achieve, but also what our main character seems to want for himself. This was a superb mixture of the themes of history, politics, interpersonal relationships, violence, and all told in a brilliantly unique way. Up next, and we have Une Femme Mariee, a film from 1964 and directed by Jean-Luc Godard, and starring Matcha Merrill, Bernard Noël and Philippe Leroy. This is the first Godard film I've seen for quite some time, so it was really wonderful to come back to his signature style of filmmaking again. I was incredibly lucky to find a copy of this long out-of-print Eureka Masters of Cinema edition of this one. It had been on my wish list for years, and I was overjoyed to find a sealed copy no less on eBay for a vaguely reasonable price. This was, again, just such an interesting film. It was shot in a way that actually reminded me a lot of Ingmar Bergman, with how he posed the actors and the close-ups. It reminded me in particular of Persona, where Bergman perhaps immortalises that style. But this film actually came out 2 years prior. This is a film that elegantly illustrates the tenderness and intimacy of two people in love. Except in this case, our main character, played by the angelic-looking Matcha Merrill, is in love with two men, one of whom she is married to. This is a classic tale of French cinema in many ways, and I'd say this one is closer in feel to something like Truffaut's earlier Jules and Jim, rather than the more tenderly brutal Le Bonheur from Agnes Varda, which came out a year after this. Together, actually, those three make incredibly interesting comparison and companion pieces, I think, of the love triangle from three different perspectives. Well, with many of Godard's films, Une Femme Mariee has an intellectual and philosophising quality to it, discussing love and what that means and what it looks like in depth, though never really giving us answers, just encouraging questions and discussion. I think Godard is rightly criticised for over-intellectualising his films at times, and I'd argue that that does happen here to a certain extent. But it is beautifully juxtaposed to the tender cinematography, which shows that physical intimacy so beautifully. And I don't mean sex by that, just touch and the closeness of two people, which is so wonderfully portrayed. Is this possibly the sweetest of Godard's films? Perhaps. But it's one that kept me thinking and mulling over what love is and what it looks like. And so, that finally brings us on to my honourable mentions. First up is Comrades, Almost a Love Story. This one was really brilliant. It's a Maggie Cheung film that I've wanted to see for years, but unfortunately not available on physical media or streaming, certainly not anywhere that I've been able to find. But the BFI had a recent Maggie Cheung season, and I was lucky enough to see this one on the big screen, which incidentally is actually the first film I've ever had the pleasure to watch actually at the BFI on the South Bank. It was a great story with lots of romantic elements and a misconnection tale to a certain extent, and of course Maggie Cheung herself absolutely shines in it. Then we have Blind Chance, a film from the incredible director Krzysztof Kieslowski. Unfortunately, I just wasn't in the right mood for this one, and so it didn't hit me as hard as I think it should have. I knew watching it that it was brilliant, but it just wasn't the right day for me, so I'll definitely be revisiting this one at the right time. It's a film all about how a tiny moment can affect the rest of your life. And lastly, we have Hirokazu Koreeda's Like Father, Like Son. Of course, I've been loving exploring Koreeda's films over the last year, and a few people have said this one is fantastic. Well, my feelings on it are quite complicated. Undoubtedly it is brilliant, but I actually struggled quite a lot with it. I found it really quite hard to watch at times, and I don't know why, to be honest. My family and relationship with my dad are drastically different, and I'm really lucky that they are great, unlike what we see in the film. But something in this one just cut me to my core, and I'm not sure I can ever watch it again, to be honest. It is brutally emotionally draining and just quite a savage film, and I actually had to pause it several times to recover before I could continue. Not an easy watch for me, that's for sure. And well, that brings us to the end of the video and my September in film. I hope you also had a wonderful month exploring many great titles, and I hope your unseasonably warm October has been going really well too. Well, that is everything from me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.